to sum it up with Christianity started out as a small sect of Jews whose rabbi, Jesus, died before being able to fulfill his quote unquote mission, but his followers just couldn't let go. A common theme among various false messianic cults within Judaism, I may add. And after a few generations, this very minuscule group of cult followers felt out of place in their synagogues, while a new group of non-Jewish pagans turned Christians resented these messianic Jews for continuing to practice Judaism and not being all in with their cause. So at a crossroad, this sect eventually splits from Judaism entirely and becomes a new religion. Can you elaborate on what ultimately led to this turn of events and all the way through the culmination of the Council of Nicaea?
All right. It's almost certain that Jesus never claimed to be the Messiah. Let's just start there. That is a claim that would be made for him. Now, it's not just in the Talmud, which is not charitable towards Jesus. I mean, there's never do we find anything in the Chazal, in the literature of our sages, that Jesus was a false Messiah. That would have been a very, very serious accusation, and they would have said it if they thought it. He's nowhere is he accused of that. He is accused of doing a lot of things, but not that. But it gets more interesting. If we look at the Gospels themselves, Jesus doesn't walk around saying, I am the Messiah. It gets even more interesting than that. If you take the book of Mark, which is the earliest, chronologically, the earliest book in the New Testament, the first 8 chapters, and it's a small book, so it's 16 chapters. The whole book is 16 chapters long. So halfway through the book, the most striking element is that Jesus' identity is not known to anyone, and it's a very important secret, and no one's supposed to know who he is. Like, how did that make it in? Why is that there? It gets even more interesting. Let's just take Matthew 16 as an example. Right before the crucifixion, Jesus, we are told in the Gospels, asks his followers who have been hanging out with him for a really long time. So Jesus had a ministry that lasted either 1 year, according to the Synoptic Gospels, according to Matthew, Mark, and Luke, or lasted 3 years, according to John, regardless. But in the Gospels, Jesus at the end goes, who do you think I am? And guess what? Nobody knows, except, we're told, Peter, who says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus' reply to Peter is, flesh and blood didn't reveal this to you. And then makes him a central, a very important apostle, and says that he gives him that name, Peter, you are the rock upon which the church will be built, the keys of heaven given to you. That's where the primacy of Peter comes from that story that we find in the Gospels. But hold on, stop the music for a moment. If Jesus is walking around claiming to be the Messiah, why would the New Testament write something so embarrassing that no one knew who he was? And even when Peter gets it, Jesus retorts that no one could have told you. That means nobody could have told you that. That means that he was not claiming to be the Messiah. And these stories are then inserted into the New Testament. How do they make it into the Gospels? It's a little tricky, because this is an apologetic. This is a defense. In the early stages of Christianity, there must have been a lot of people going around saying that this guy, Jesus, never claimed to be the Messiah. Why do you think he is? And then the Gospels have to put into the text. I mean, these ideas have to creep into an oral tradition that ultimately gets written down by these four anonymous authors of the Gospels that, well, actually was a big secret nobody knew. And no one knew to the end. Or else how did he get in there? I know you, the viewer, are thinking, well, how do I draw these conclusions when I don't believe in the New Testament? It means, how could anyone use a book that people believe, a holy book, which I don't believe in? How can I use that to prove anything if I don't believe in it? Like, you can't have it both ways. If I don't believe in the book, how can I use the book? Well, there are certain rigorous methods that we can use to examine any book of antiquity and ask the question, is any of this historical? That means you may have a book that's not a holy book, but it doesn't mean that there's no historical characters in there or there's nothing that happened in there that's historical. We have many, a Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's court. There are historical characters in Hamlet. That means, can it be that the Christian Bible contains some history in it and was left there as a relic? And if there is, how could you know it without playing the game of cherry picking? Well, the answer is, if there's something in the book, this is like the most rigorous method to be able to draw that conclusion. It's called, essentially, it's called many things, or we'll call it the criteria of embarrassment. The idea is that if there's something in the Christian Bible that's very embarrassing to Christianity, it's very unlikely that someone invented it. If there's something in the New Testament that does not portray the disciples, Jesus' followers, as great, as terrific, then it's unlikely someone would have made it up if there's something embarrassing about Paul. Okay, this is a very simple method, and it's highly rigorous. Here's a case where its application is perfect, because this is something very embarrassing. Nobody knew who Jesus was. The disciples themselves are asked, "Who do you think I am?" They have no idea. In the book of Mark, again, the earliest gospel, it's the biggest secret in the world who Jesus is. Like, no one is supposed to know. Like, why is that in there? You know, so therefore, that would indicate that he actually didn't claim to be the Messiah. Likely, he was someone that was perhaps teaching that the end of the world is coming, like everybody else at the time. I mean, at that time in the first century, living in Eretz Yisrael, living in the land of Israel under the heel of the empire was not an easy matter. There was no Jewish agencies, no Israeli defense forces. There was nothing like that. You were living under oppression, and therefore that would explain him getting killed. And then people later would say, well, he was an innocent person that got crucified, wrongly executed. And then some would say, well, I saw him, you know, he came to me, it appeared to me, probably someone like Mary Magdalene, who was out of her mind. Even the New Testament concedes that she was possessed by devils. So that's how the whole thing developed. Not him walking around claiming he's the Messiah, and that's where it developed during his lifetime. That's a later claim than is then written into the text.
Interesting. So yeah, I find it very interesting that I noticed, like in the comment sections of a lot of your videos, where like you completely nailed it. Somebody, you know, a Christian commentating is citing a Christian verse to prove their, you know, point, which really to me always never made any sense. Like, why are they using the New Testament to prove the New Testament's claims? But anyway, I didn't want to touch on the Council of Nicaea, because I feel like that's a very big turning point in the history of the church. So can you just, in summary, tell our audience like what exactly happened during that time? Because obviously, you know, with the Trinity and all these ideas, they came to fruition.
So in the early period of the church, which means the first 3 centuries, there were enormous schisms in Christianity. These schisms did not begin after the New Testament was written. We find these schisms in the writings of the New Testament, particularly in the letters of Paul and the book of Acts. Christians are fighting each other nonstop. In fact, in Paul's writings, it's Christians that are fighting with Christians more than Jews, meaning non-Christian Jews. The idea that Jesus was divine and God-like is already developing in the Christian Bible. It's a slow development with an adoptionist theology in the book of Mark. By the time you get to the book of John, which is the last, probably written about 95, the last book to be written in the New Testament, Jesus is already presented as a divine being. Now, a divine being in the Greco-Roman world does not mean God created the universe equal to Jupiter. It meant that you were like divine, like you were up there. But this was a henotheistic pagan system where there's like the great God, and then there are many, many lower tier gods that were both mortal and divine at the same time. But you see where all this is going. This is all moving into full-blown idolatry. By the 2nd century, we have Tertullian, a church father from Carthage, who comes up with the word Trinity, invents it at the end of the 2nd century. It's so interesting that you have Rabbi Huda Nasi in Israel compiling the Mishnah. At the very same time, in in Carthage, you have Tertullian, exact same time, inventing the word Trinity. He didn't believe in the Trinity in the Orthodox sense, but it was already emerging in the early church that Jesus was God, but they had a problem, and that is, we have to believe there's one God because we believe in the Jewish Bible, and if God the Father is God, but there's also God the Son, doesn't that make 2 gods? And if there's a Holy Spirit that's God, doesn't make it 3 gods, and that can't be. And there's enormous division in the church in the 2nd, 3rd, and early 4th century, huge division of exactly what was the nature of Jesus's divinity. Enormous issue. The basic argument came down to, was Jesus from the get-go always God equal to the Father and was eternal, had no beginning? Or was there a point in time when only the Father existed and Jesus the Son came into existence in the eternal past? This was the explosion in the church. And it became into such a battle, the whole church was divided over this. These were not the only 2 views, but these were the 2 big views that emerged by the 4th century. What changes everything is in the year 312, in the fall of 312, the Emperor of Rome, Constantine, is a big anti-Semite. He wins a battle in October of 312, and he attributes his victory to the Christian God. And as a result, he essentially becomes a Christian and makes Christianity a legal religion. So now Christianity is a legal religion, and then it would emerge to be a preferred religion. It doesn't become the official religion of the Roman Empire until later on in the 4th century. But Constantine was very unhappy with this schism about what was the nature of the divinity of Jesus. So this is a huge argument. There was a thinker, actually 2 thinkers from Alexandria that fought over this. And this was an enormous dispute, and Constantine was very unhappy with this. There was one other schism in the church that had to be solved. This is what most people don't know. And that is when to celebrate Easter. Until that point, most Christians celebrate Easter based on when the Jews said it was Passover. Now, I don't want to get more complicated because John disagrees with the Synoptic Gospels over on what day Jesus was crucified. I don't want to get into that, so I'm just going to leave it alone and just say that a large, significant segment of the Christian world for the first 3 centuries celebrated Easter when the Jews said it was Passover. The Jewish calendar is oral Torah, okay? In order to create a Jewish calendar, you need to have information how to create the calendar and when to intercalate an extra month in order to keep Passover in the springtime, because the Torah says so in Deuteronomy 16, verse 1. It's oral Torah. Right now, just take my word for it. You have to know an oral tradition in order to know how to have a calendar. Meaning you need the Jews. It's not a 12-month calendar. There's nowhere in Tanakh that says a year is comprised by 12 months. Doesn't exist. I know you think it does. It doesn't. So listen carefully. But as you can imagine, in Rome, it was becoming a little... Bishops in Rome and roundabout were becoming very uneasy about the notion that we have to rely on the Jews when to determine when Easter was. So another idea was going is we have to do away with the Jewish view altogether and set Easter to another date. These were the 2 issues that really were set to divide the empire, the deity of Jesus and the calendar. Do we depend on the Jews for determining when Easter was? And Constantine summoned bishops from the east and the west. Remember, Constantine presided over both the east and the west, and that would continue until Theodosius, the end of the 4th century, when Theodosius was emperor. The east and the west were under a common emperor during this period. the key point is, he said he called bishops, hundreds of them came, and had to set this and voted on it. And ultimately, I write about this in volume 1 of Let's Get Biblical. Ultimately, there's a vote, and the Christians decide, the bishops decide, that we're going to believe in the iteration of the doctrine of the Trinity, that Jesus is eternal, that he was always eternal, and he's very light, the creed that emerges from the Council of Nicaea, and that Easter will not be determined by the Jewish calendar based on the vernal equinox, which is the solar calendar. And that has an enormous consequence, because that's why the church became very anti-Torah Sheba'al Peh, anti the oral Torah, and the church would just become completely weighed down by this idolatry, which is a self-inflicted wound from which they have never recovered.
Wow. Eye-opening stuff.